To part 3 of reading The Phantom Tollbooth. We are on chapter 5, Short Shrift, page 70. I thank you very much, said Faintly Macabre. You may call me Aunt Faintly. Here, have a punctuation mark. And she held out a box of sugar-coated question marks, periods, commas, and exclamation points. That's all I get to eat now. Well, when I get out of here, I'm gonna help you, Milo declared forcefully. That's very nice of you, she replied. But the only thing that can help me is the return of rhyme and reason. The return of what? Asked Milo. Rhyme and reason, she repeated. But that's another long story, and you may not want to hear it. Oh, we would like to very much, barked Talk. We really would, agreed Milo, and as the witch rocked slowly back and forth, she told them this story. Chapter 6, Faintly Macabre's Story. This is the whole thing. Okay. In that case, once upon a time, so Macabre is saying this, but I'm going to do it in, Macabre is saying the story, but I'm going to not do it in my Macabre voice. Once upon a time, this land was a barren and frightening wilderness, whose high rocky mountains sheltered the evil winds and whose barren valleys offered hospitality to no man. Few things grew, and those that did were bent and twisted, and their fruit was bitter as wormwood. What wasn't waste was desert, and what wasn't desert was rock. And the demons of darkness made their home in the hills. Evil creatures roamed at will through the countryside and down to the sea. It was known as the Land of Null. Then one day a small ship appeared on the Sea of Knowledge. It carried a young prince seeking the future. In the name of goodness and truth, he laid claim to all the country and set out to explore his new domain. The demons, monsters, and giants were furious at his presumption and banded together to drive him out. The earth shook with their battle, and when they had finished, all that remained to the prince was a small piece of land at the edge of the sea. I'll build my city here, he declared, and that is what he did. Before long, more ships came bearing settlers for the new land, and the city grew and pushed its boundaries farther and farther out. Each day it was attacked anew, but nothing could destroy the prince's new city, and grow it did. Soon it was no longer just a city. It was a kingdom, and it was called the Kingdom of Wisdom. But outside the walls all was not safe, and the new king vowed to conquer the land that was rightfully his. So each spring he set forth with his army, and each autumn he returned, and year by year the kingdom grew larger and more prosperous. He took to himself a wife, and before long had 2 fine young sons, whom he taught everything he knew, so that one day they might rule wisely. When the boys grew to young manhood, the king called them to him and said, I am becoming an old man, and can no longer go forth in battle. You must take my place and found new cities in the wilderness, for the kingdom of wisdom must grow. And so they did. One went south to the foothills of confusion and built Dictionopolis, the city of words. And one went north to the mountain of ignorance and built Digitopolis. Haha. What? I'm going to say that again. And so they did. One went south to the foothills of confusion and built Dictionopolis, the city of words. And one went north to the mountains of ignorance and built Digitopolis, the city of numbers. Both cities flourished mightily, and the demons were driven back still farther. Still further. Still further. Soon other cities and towns were founded in the new lands, and at last only the farthest reaches of the wilderness remained to these terrible creatures, and there they waited, ready to strike all who ventured near or relaxed their guard. The two brothers were glad, however, to go their separate ways, for they were by nature very suspicious and jealous. Each one tried to outdo the other, and they worked so hard and diligently at it that before long their cities rivaled even wisdom in size and grandeur. "Words are more important than wisdom," said one privately. "Numbers are more important than wisdom," thought the other to himself, and they grew to dislike each other more and more. And the old king, however, who knew nothing of his son's animosity, was very happy in the twilight of his reign, and spent his days quietly walking and contemplating in the royal gardens. His only regret was that he'd never had a daughter, for he loved little girls as much as he loved little boys. One day, as he was strolling peacefully about the grounds, he discovered two tiny babies that had been abandoned in a basket under the grape arbor. They were beautiful, golden-haired girls. The king was overjoyed. "They have been sent to crown my old age," he cried, and called the queen, his ministers, the palace staff, and indeed the entire population to see them. "We'll call this one Rhyme, and this one Reason," he said, and so they became the Princess of Sweet Rhyme and the Princess of Pure Reason, and were brought up in the palace. When the old king finally died, the kingdom was divided between his two sons, with the provision that they would be equally responsible for the welfare of the young princesses. One son went south and became Azaz the Unabridged, king of Dictionopolis, and the other went north and became Mathemagician, ruler of Digitopolis. And true to their words, they both provided well for the little girls, who continued to live in wisdom. Everyone loved the princesses, and because of their great beauty, their gentle ways, and their ability to settle all controversies fairly and reasonably, people with problems or grievances or arguments came from all over the land to seek advice. And even the two brothers, who by this time were fighting continuously, often called upon them to help decide matters of state. It was all said by everyone that rhyme and reason answer all problems. As the years passed, the two brothers grew farther and farther apart, and their separate kingdoms became richer and grander. Their disputes, however, became more and more difficult to reconcile, but always with patience and love, the princesses set things right. Then one day they had the most terrible quarrel of all. The reason I just paused is because I realized it's King Az. It's letters Az. Then one day they had the most terrible quarrel of all. King Az. Or is it Az? Let's see. Az. I'm gonna go with Az. I like that. King Az insisted that words were far more significant than numbers, and hence his kingdom was truly the greater. And the mathemagician claimed that numbers were much more important than words, and hence his kingdom was supreme. They discussed and debated, and raved and ranted, until they were on the verge of blows, when it was decided to submit the question to arbitration by the princesses. After days of careful consideration, in which all the evidence was weighed and all the witnesses heard, they made their decision. Words and numbers are of equal value, for in the cloak of knowledge one is warp and the other is woof. It is no more important to count the sands than it is to name the stars. Therefore let both kingdoms live in peace. Everyone was pleased with the verdict, Everyone, that is, but the brothers, who were besides themselves with anger. "What good are these girls if they cannot settle an argument in someone's favor?" they growled, since both were more interested in their own advantage than in the truth. "We'll banish them from the kingdom forever." And so they were taken from the palace and sent far away to the castle in the air, and they have not been seen since. That is why today, in all this land, there is neither rhyme nor reason. "And what happened to the two rulers?" asked Milo. Banishing the two princesses was the last thing they ever agreed upon, and they soon fell to warring with each other. Despite this, their own kingdoms have continued to prosper, but the old city of wisdom has fallen into great disrepair, and there is no one to set things right. So you see, until the princesses return, I shall have to stay here." "Maybe we can rescue them," said Milo as he saw how sad the witch looked. "Ah, that would be very difficult," she replied. "The castle in the air is far from here, and the one stairway which leads to it is guarded by fierce and black-hearted demons." Talk growled ominously, for he hated even the thought of demons. "I'm afraid there's not much a little boy and a dog can do," she said. "But never you mind, it's not so bad. I've grown quite used to it here. But you must be going, or else you'll waste the whole day." "Oh, we're here for 6 million years," sighed Milo, "and I don't see any way to escape." "Oh, nonsense," scolded the witch. "You mustn't take Officer Shrift so seriously. He loves to put people in prison, but he doesn't care about keeping them there. Now just press that button in the wall and be on your way." Milo pressed the button, and a door swung open, letting in a shaft of brilliant sunshine. "Goodbye, come again," shouted the witch as they stepped outside and the door slammed shut. Milo and Tok stood blinking in the bright light, and as their eyes became accustomed to it, the first thing they saw were the king's advisors again rushing towards them. "Oh, there you are! Where have you been? We've been looking all over for you. The royal banquet is about to begin. Come with us." They seemed very agitated and out of breath as Milo walked along with them. "But what about my car?" "Don't need it," said the Duke. "No use for it," said the minister. "Superfluous," advised the Count. "Unnecessary," stated the Earl. "Uncalled for," cried the Undersecretary. "We'll take our vehicle. Conveyance, rig, char-blanc, chariot, buggy, coach, brougham, shendehan." Those are a couple words there I do not know. They repeated quickly in order, and pointed to a small wooden wagon. "Oh dear, all those words again," thought Milo as he climbed into the wagon with Tok and the cabinet members. "How are you going to make it move? It doesn't have a—" "Be very quiet, for it goes without saying," said the Duke. And sure enough, as soon as they were all quiet— my nose itches, I apologize. Didn't actually help. And sure enough, as soon as they were all quite still, it began to move quickly through the streets, and in a very short time they arrived at the royal palace. Chapter 7. The Royal Banquet. "Right this way! Follow us! Come along! Step lively! Here we go!" they shouted, hopping from the wagon and bounding up the broad marble stairway. Milo and Tok followed close behind. It was a strange-looking palace, and if he didn't know better, Milo would have said that it looked exactly like an enormous book, standing on end, with its front door in the lower part of the binding, just where they usually place the publisher's name. Once again they hurried down a long hallway, which glittered with crystal chandeliers and echoed with their footsteps. The walls and ceilings were covered with mirrors, whose reflections danced dizzily along with them, and the footmen bowed coldly. "We must be terribly late," gasped the Earl nervously as they reached the tall doors of the banquet hall. It was a vast room, full of people loudly talking and arguing. The long table was carefully set with gold plates and linen napkins. An attendant stood behind each chair, and at the center, raised slightly above the others, was a throne, covered in crimson cloth. Directly behind, on the wall, was the royal coat of arms, flanked by the flags of Dictionopolis. Milo noticed many of the people he had seen in the marketplace. The letterman was busy explaining to an interested group the history of the W, and off in the corner the humbug and the spelling bee were arguing fiercely about nothing at all. Officer Shrift wandered through the crowd, suspiciously muttering, "Guilty, they're all guilty, 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 guilty." And on noticing Milo, brightened visibly and commented in passing, "Oh, is it 6 million years already? Oh, my, how time flies." Everyone seemed quite grumpy about having to wait for lunch, and they were all relieved to see the tardy guests arrive. "Certainly glad you finally made it, old man," said the humbug, cordially pumping Milo's hand. "As guest of the honored, you must choose the menu, of course." "Oh my," he thought, not knowing what to say. "Be quick about it," suggested the spelling bee. "I'm famished, Famished." As Milo tried to think, there was an ear-shattering blast of trumpets, entirely off-key, and a page announced to the startled guest, "King Az, the Unabridged." The king strode through the door and over to the table and settled his great bulk onto the throne, calling irritably, "Places, everyone! Take your places!" As he was the largest man Milo had ever seen, with a great stomach, large, piercing eyes, a gray beard that reached to his waist, and a silver signet ring on the little finger of his left hand. He also wore a small crown and a robe with the letters of the alphabet beautifully embroidered all over it. "What have we here?" he said, staring down at Tock and Milo as everyone else took his place. Interjection of just the interesting, this sentence, staring down at Tock and Milo as everyone else took his place. So everyone is male, I guess, in the kingdom. The only females have been Faintly Macabre and the sisters, Rhyme and Reason. Anyway, what have we here? He said, staring down at Tock and Milo as everyone else took his place. If you please... "If you please," said Milo, "my name is Milo, and this is Tock. Thank you very much for inviting us to your banquet, and I think your palace is beautiful." "Exquisite! Lovely! I think your palace is beautiful. Exquisite," corrected the Duke. "Lovely," counselled the minister. "Handsome," recommended the Count. "Pretty," hinted the Earl. "Charming," submitted the Undersecretary. "Silence," suggested the King. "Now, young man, what can you do to entertain us? Sing songs, tell stories, compose sonnets, juggle plates, do tumbling tricks. Wait, which is it?" "I can't do any of those things," admitted Milo. What an ordinary little boy," commented the King. "Why, my cabinet members can do all sorts of things. The Duke here can make mountains out of molehills. The minister splits hairs. The Count makes hay while the sun shines. The Earl leaves no stone unturned. And the Undersecretary," he finished ominously, "hangs by a thread. Can you do anything at all?" I can count to 1,000, offered Milo.
"Oh, numbers! Never mention numbers here. Only use them when absolutely necessary and you have to," growled Az disgustedly. "Now, Why don't you and Talk come up here and sit next to me, and we'll have some dinner?
Yeah, are you ready with the menu? Reminded the humbug. Well, said Milo, remembering that his mother had always told him to eat lightly when he was a guest. Why don't we have a light meal?
A light meal it shall be,
roared the bug, waving his arms. The waitresses rushed in carrying large serving platters and set them on the table in front of the king. When he lifted the covers, shafts of brilliant colored light leaped from the plates and bounced around the ceiling, the walls, across the floor, and out the windows.
Not a very substantial meal, said the humbug, rubbing his eyes, but quite an attractive one. Perhaps you can suggest something a little more filling.
The king clapped his hands, the platters were removed, and without thinking, Milo quickly suggested, well, in that case, I think we ought to have a square meal of...
A square meal it is,
shouted the humbug again. The king clapped his hands once more, and the waiters reappeared, carrying plates heaped high with streaming squares of all sizes and colors.
"So,"
said the spelling bee, tasting one,
"these are awful."
No one else seemed to like them very much either, and the humbug got one caught in his throat and almost choked.
"Time for speeches,"
announced the king, as the plates were again removed and everyone looked glum.
You first," he commanded,
pointing at Milo. Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen, started Milo timidly, I would like to take this opportunity to say that in all the...
That's quite enough, snapped the king. Mustn't talk all day.
But I'd just begun, objected Milo.
Next,
bellowed the king.
Yeah, roast turkey, mashed potatoes, vanilla ice cream,
recited the humbug, bouncing up and down quickly. What a strange speech, thought Milo, for he'd heard many in the past and knew that they were supposed to be long and dull.
The hamburgers, corn on the cob, and chocolate pudding, pudding,
said the spelling bee in his turn.
The prime fritters, sour pickles, strawberry jam,
shouted Officer Shrimp from his chair. Since he was taller sitting than standing, he didn't bother to get up. And so down the line it went, with each guest rising briefly, making a short speech, and then resuming his place. When everyone had finished, the king rose.
Pâté de foie, soupe à la gourson, fazé sous cloche, salade d'hiver, fromage fouetté, dîme tassé,
he said carefully, and clapped his hands again. The waiters reappeared immediately, carrying heavy hot trays, which they set on the table. Each one contained the exact words spoken by the various guests, and they all began eating immediately with great gusto.
"Dig in,"
said the king, poking Milo with his elbow, and looking disapprovingly at his plate.
"I can't say that I think much of your choice."
"I didn't know that I was going to have to eat my words," objected Milo.
Of course, everyone here does," said the king. The king grunted. "You should have made a tastier speech."
Milo looked around at everyone busily stuffing himself, and then back at his own unappetizing plate. It certainly didn't look worth eating, and he was so very hungry.
"Here, have some somersault," suggested the Duke. "It improves the flavor."
"Have a ringamore," offered the Count, passing the bread basket.
"Or a ragamuffin,"
seconded the Mister.
"Perhaps you'll care for synonym bun."
"Synonym bun," suggested the Duke. "Why not wait for your just desserts?" mumbled the Earl indistinctly, his mouth full of food.
"How many times must I tell you not to bite off more than you can chew?" snapped the Undersecretary, patting the distressed Earl on the back. "In one ear, out the other," scolded the Duke, attempting to stuff one of his words through the Earl's head. "If it isn't one thing, it's another," chided the Minister.
"Out the frying pan, into the fire," shouted the cunt, burning himself badly.
"Well, you don't have to bite my head off,"
screamed the terrified Earl, and flew at the others in rage. The 5 of them scuffled wildly under the table.
"Stop that at once!" thundered Az, "or I'll banish the lot of you!"
Sorry.
"Excuse me."
Forgive me.
"Pardon."
Regrets. They apologized in turn and sat down glaring at each other. The rest of the meal was finished in silence until the king, wiping the gravy stains from his vest, called for dessert. Milo, who had not eaten anything, looked up eagerly.
"We're having a special treat today,"
said the king, as the delicious smells of homemade pastry filled the banquet hall.
"By royal command of the pastry chefs have worked up..."
Blah, 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 blah. Let's try that again.
"By royal command, the pastry chefs have worked all night in the half-bakery to make sure that..."
"The half-bakery?" questioned Milo.
"Of course, the half-bakery," snapped the king. "Where do you think half-baked ideas come from? Now please, don't interrupt. By royal command, the pastry chefs have worked all night to..."
What's a half... Starting to get tongue-tied this evening. "What's a half-baked idea?" asked Milo again.
"Will you be quiet?"
growled Az angrily. But before he could begin again, 3 large serving carts were wheeled into the hall, and everyone jumped up to help himself.
"They're very tasty," explained the humbug, "but they don't always agree with you. Here's one that's very good."
He handed it to Milo, and through the icing and nuts Milo saw that it said, "The earth is flat."
People swallowed that one for years.
Oh no. "People swallowed that one for years," commented the spelling bee. "But it's not very popular these days. DAYS." He picked up a long one that stated, "The moon is made of green cheese," and hungrily bit off the part that said, "cheese."
"Now there's a half-baked idea," he said, smiling.
Milo looked at the great assortment of cakes, which were being eaten almost as quickly as anyone could read them. The count was munching contentedly on "It never rains, but it pours," and the king was busy slicing one that stated, "Night air is bad air."
I wouldn't eat too many of those if I were you," advised Talk. "And they don't look too good, but you can't get terribly sick of them."
"Don't worry," Milo replied. "I'll just wrap one up for later." And he folded his napkin around. Everything happens for the best. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. The Humbug Volunteers. "Couldn't eat another thing," puffed the Duke, clutching his stomach.
"Oh my, oh dear," agreed the minister, breathing with great difficulty.
Mumbled the Earl, desperately trying to swallow another mouthful. "Thoroughly stuffed," sighed the Count, loosening his belt.
"Full up,"
grunted the Undersecretary, reaching for the last cake. As everyone finished, the only sounds to be heard were the creaking of chairs, the pushing of plates, the licking of spoons, and, of course, a few words from the humbug.
A delightful repast, delicately prepared and elegantly served,"
he announced to no one in particular.
"A feast of ware banquet. My compliments to the chef. By all means, my compliments to the chef."
Then, with a most distressed look on his face, he turned to Milo and gasped,
"Would you kindly fetch me a glass of water? I seem to have a touch of indigestion."
"Perhaps you've eaten too much too quickly," Milo remarked sympathetically.
"Too much too quickly? Too much too quickly?"
wheezed the uncomfortable bug between gulps.
"To be sure, too much too quickly. I most certainly should have eaten too little too slowly, or too much too slowly, or too little too quickly, or taken all day to eat nothing, or eaten everything in no time at all, or occasionally eaten something any time, or perhaps I should have..."
And he toppled back, exhausted, into his chair, and continued to mumble indistinctly.
"Attention, attention! Let me have your attention!"
insisted the king, leaping to his feet and pounding the table. The command was entirely unnecessary, for the moment he began to speak, everyone but Milo, Talk, and the distraught Bug rushed from the hall, down the stairs, and out of the palace.
"Royal subjects and friends," continued AZAZ,
his voice echoing in the almost empty room.
"Once again on this gala occasion we have—"
Pardon me," coughed Milo as politely as possible, "but everyone has gone."
"I was hoping no one would notice," said the king sadly. "It happens every time."
"They've all got their dinner. They've all got to dinner," announced the humbug weakly, "and just as soon as I catch my breath I shall join them." "That's ridiculous. How can they eat dinner right after a banquet?"
"Scandalous!" shouted the king. "We'll put a stop to it at once. From now on, by royal command, everyone must eat dinner before the banquet."
"But that's just as bad," protested Milo.
You mean just as good,"
corrected the humbug.
"Things which are equally bad are also equally good. Try to look at the bright side of things."
"I don't know which side of anything to look at," protested Milo. "Everything is so confusing, and all your words only make things worse."
"How true,"
said the unhappy king, resting his regal chin on the royal fist as he thought fondly of the old days.
"There must be something we can do about it. Hey, pass a law," the humbug suggested brightly. "We have almost as many laws as words," grumbled the king.
I'll offer a reward," offered the bug again. The king shook his head and looked sadder and sadder. "Send for help, drive a bargain, pull the switch, file a brief, lower the broom, toe the line, raise the bridge, bar the door," shouted the bug.
"Bar the door!"
shouted the bug, jumping up and down and waving his arms. And then he promptly sat down as the king glanced furiously in his direction. "Perhaps you might allow rhyme and reason to return," said Milo softly, for he had been waiting for just such an opportunity to suggest it.
"How nice that would be,"
said AZAZ, straightening up and adjusting his crown.
"Even if they were a bother at times. Things always went so well when they were here."
As he spoke, he leaned back on the throne, clasped his hands behind his head, and stared thoughtfully at the ceiling.
"But I'm afraid it can't be done."
"Yes, certainly not. It can't be done," repeated the humbug. "Why not?" asked Milo.
"Why, indeed?" exclaimed the blood, who seemed equally at home on either